believe it or not, we actually already worked a little bit with pedigrees in first semester. We looked at like the Queen Victorian bloodline. You guys didn't actually draw the pedigree though, you just kind of analyzed it. Now we're going to work on actually making and analyzing. So that's what we're working at today, pedigrees. Pedigrees are like a family tree, but we can use them to trace genetic inheritance. Ava, you know what would work great? You know what would work great? If you had a stylus and you could write on your screen. I know. I'm just saying it would be great if that would work. Then this would work. All right, so a couple of quick basics. Square is male. Circle is female. Line connecting them means mating. Oftentimes marriage. Doesn't necessarily have to be marriage, though. Mating is possible, sans the marriage. But a lot of times we talk about it as marriage. When you have a couple and they have offspring, it is shown as a line coming, it is shown as a line coming off of that couple. So here's our offspring. Don't write this. I'm going to show you something I see a lot, and it's a pretty big mistake. I mean, unless it's not a mistake, but it's not legal in most states. So hopefully it was a mistake. A lot of people do it incorrectly. Again, don't write this. I'm just showing you what not to write. But a lot of people do something like this. And that's no good. Don't do that. Again, not legal in most states. I think every state. Not legal in most countries. I'm going to assume it's not happening. You guys just did your pedigree poorly. So watch out for that. It's a mistake a lot of people make. Again, when you have offspring, they come down and they connect. So don't do it like this. Coming down, not connecting to one another. We do oftentimes have marriages in the second generation. So something else to show here. We usually list the generation in Roman numerals off to the side. And as you can imagine, we can get pretty big generations. You know, we get 3, 4, 5, 6 generations sometimes. I think you guys had a lot of generations in that Queen Victorian pedigree we did at the beginning of the year. Often, this gets tough. We can't always do this, but often we try to list from left to right, oldest to youngest. Again, that's not always possible to do. The reason why it's not always possible to do is a lot of times these second generation people, they get married as well. And so you have to kind of tack on, you know, the daughter's husband. And maybe he's the youngest of all of them, but you have to put him somewhere. You know, you can't just make him the youngest, put him way over here. So not always possible. Ayla. Not always possible to list them oldest to youngest, but we try whenever possible, especially like children of a family, we try to list them oldest to youngest. Questions so far? Are we good so far? Cool. All right. Again, I bet you guys have already seen this, maybe even worked with it. That's way too big of a circle. Why is it too big of a circle? Because I got to shade this one. Shade, shade, shade. We love to shade. This is an affected female. Guys, I'm not saying infected. We're not always looking at diseases or bad things. Yeah, a lot of times we are, but not always. We used to have a pedigree where we were looking at freckles. People have or don't have freckles. That's not a disease. There's nothing wrong with freckles. This person just is affected by the trait. They have freckles. So affected, not afflicted, not infected, affected. They have the trait. And obviously with a square that is shaded, that is a affected male. Sometimes you get a half shaded individual, and this means a carrier. What does a carrier mean? Well, it means they don't have the trait, but they're carrying it. So they have the dominant allele, but they're also carrying the recessive allele. They're carrying the trait. So here's a carrier female, and then obviously a carrier male would be a half shaded square. I like to go diagonally. You don't have to go diagonally. A lot of times you see them, a lot of people just go straight up and down and color one side up or down. But I go diagonally, whatever the reason, this should be a carrier male. Again, they don't have the trait, but they're carrying the recessive allele. They display the dominant phenotype. They don't have it, but they carry it. A lot of times you can't do this, and most often when you see a pedigree, this isn't written in because they want you to kind of figure it out. But when you do know it, and you don't always, but when you do know it, you can fill it in. Questions so far? All right, let's take a look at some like distinguishing features you guys can identify. Different things to look for to identify what type of trait. James. All right, so first we're going to take a look at autosomal recessive. Autosomal, been a while since we heard that term, maybe back to January, February, somewhere in there. Autosomal means non-X linked. Remember, for humans, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 total. Our 23rd pair is our XX or XY. Those are our sex chromosomes. They determine our sex. Anything else, so chromosomes 1 through 22, those are autosomal chromosomes. You have 2 of all of those. So it's only the X and the Y that you might potentially only have 1 of, and that's only if you're male, and that's what makes it a big deal. But for autosomal, we all have diploid, we all have a pair of those chromosomes. All right, so good ways to tell that you're working with an autosomal, non-X-linked recessive trait. Here's an indication that you have an autosomal recessive trait. So we have an offspring that has a trait that neither parent has. If this were a dominant trait, at least one of the parents would have to have it. Where did that dominant letter come from? It had to have come from one of the parents. One of the parents would have to have that trait. So because neither parent does, it's an indication that you're working with a recessive allele. So both parents do not have the trait. So we know that they both have a dominant allele. They don't display the trait, they have a dominant allele. But this individual right here has the trait. So little b, it's a recessive trait. So that means we must know the other allele for these parents. They both gave a little b. Bless you. There's only one way this person got little b, and that's if this person gave a little b and that person gave a little b. What do we know about the daughter? Do we know anything about the daughter? We know she has one big B. She's not shaded in. She does not have the trait. Do we know about the second allele, though? We do not. I like to put a little blank right there. We don't know about that second allele. Could be dominant, could be recessive. We aren't sure. I put a little blank. Ava? Can you say it a little bit louder? I'm sorry. Good. So really good question. If you guys were making this pedigree, yes, you should probably go and shade those parents in. You know that they are carriers. They're both carriers. But a lot of times you won't be given that information. Like a lot of times we analyze the pedigree instead of making it. And a lot of times they don't shade in the individuals because they want you to figure it out. So yes, if this was the pedigree that you were making, Ava, you'd want to shade it in. But a lot of times they're not going to give it to you that way. They're just going to give it to you either you see the trait or you don't. And so I'm saying, hey, if you see two parents that don't have a trait and the offspring does, good chance it's autosomal recessive. One other thing to look for. If it is autosomal recessive and you have two parents that are both shaded in, guess what? Something else to look for, if you have two parents that are shaded in, every one of their offspring should be also shaded in. Remember, there's only one way to be shaded in, and that's to be homozygous recessive. If the trait is recessive. If they're both little b, what's the only thing either one of them could ever give? Little b. So all their kids would also be shaded in. Peyton. Make sense? Question so far? Everybody's good? Cool. All right. Okay, what if it's an autosomal dominant trait? Again, autosomal means it's chromosomes 1 to 22. The X-linked or chromosome pair number 23. So autosomal means everyone has 2 of each allele. Good way to tell you have an autosomal dominant trait. Two parents have the trait, or have the trait. And one of their children doesn't. Again, on the last picture, we showed, hey, if it's autosomal recessive, when two parents have the trait, their children must all have that trait as well, because there's only one allele they can each give, and they're homozygous recessive, so they must be giving that homozygous recessive. So a good thing to tell that you're working with an autosomal dominant trait is not all offspring. Not all the offspring have the trait. Look at this guy. He's not shaded, or she's not shaded. Definitely not an autosomal recessive trait. Good chance it's an autosomal dominant trait. Again, we know that these parents must be heterozygous. They both give a little n to this individual. It's a dominant trait. So people are shaded when they have the allele. This person's not shaded, which must mean that they don't have the dominant version of it. There's only one way to not be shaded. So both parents must be carrying that little n allele. What do we know about the brothers? We know they have one big N. Do we know anything else? No, we don't know if they're homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Again, I like to leave a little blank. We don't know. Shaded always represents affected individual. Whether it's recessive or dominant, whatever trait you're talking about. Again, freckles. I might be talking about the trait of freckles. Whoever has freckles then is shaded. Whether freckles is a dominant trait or recessive trait is oftentimes up to you to determine. And so that's kind of what we're doing. If I gave you this pedigree, no letters on it, and I said, hey, here's a pedigree for people with freckles, you know everyone shaded has freckles. Your job is to figure out, is freckles dominant or recessive? And so for this one, you'd say, oh, I guess freckles is the dominant allele or dominant trait. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's kind of the answers what you're asking? Awesome. Cool. Hey, big thing. There are no carriers in autosomal dominant. You either have it or you don't. We don't say someone's a carrier if they're carrying the recessive normal allele. You carry the trait we're talking about. You don't carry the lack of the trait. Does that make sense? Yeah, so yeah, these guys are carrying the lack of the trait, but that's not really what we're looking at. We are looking at, do they have the trait or not? In this case, they do have the trait. So it's a flat yes or no for autosomal dominant. Cool. Questions? Onward and upward. So now we're getting into the sex linked. Again, autosomal, those are the ones that everyone has too. Sex linked is special though because half of people only have one. All right, a good way to tell that you have a sex linked recessive trait I'm actually going to make a 3-generational one here. Oops, nope. Not shading that one in. Keep you here, and I'll come over and I'll bring Steven in again. Okay. Because she's right next to me. All right, so good way to tell that you have a sex-linked recessive allele. If you have a recessive sex-linked trait, any mother that has it is going to pass it on to her sons. So red, green colorblind, for example, if a mother is red, green colorblind, her sons will be also. Period. End of story. Why is that the case? Well, if she has the trait and it's a recessive trait, she has to pass that X on to her sons. She has to. What about dad? Why can't dad cover it up? Dad doesn't have the trait. He must be dominant. But why doesn't he? Why can't he cover it up? Why does this have to be the case? Excellent. Yep. It's a son. Sons inherit the Y from their father. They don't get the X from their father. If they got the X from their father, guess what? They'd be a daughter. How it works. So the only X that a son gets is from his mom. He gets the Y from his dad. So any affected mom is going to have affected sons. Period. End of story. End of story. How about this daughter over here? What do we know about her? So she's not shaded. So that means she has the capital H. Do we know the other allele or should we draw a blank? What do we know about her? Hubert? Why do we know she's going to have XLH? Awesome. Yep. Yep. First of all, we know she's X big H because she's not shaded. But also, we know she's X big H because she had to have gotten that from her father. She must have gotten an X little h from mom because what else could mom give her? She must be X little h. Here we go. If you wanted to, again, you could shade her. Oops. You could shade her if you wanted to because she is a carrier. We know she's a carrier. All right, so down here then, second part of this. Second part of this, again, another way that we know that working with a sex-linked recessive trait is that fathers do not pass it on to their sons. So we have a father, his sons, not affected. There's only one way for a son to not be affected, and that's to have the capital allele. He can't be heterozygous, so the only thing he must have is capital H. Evan? Daughter. Oh, over here? 50% chance of her giving the color. Well, it depends on her mate. If she marries a normal visioned husband and all she has is daughters, none of them will be colorblind because the normal vision father will pass on the dominant allele. Regardless of what she passes on, her daughters will have normal vision. Well, if you're limiting it to just the sons and you're ignoring any daughters, you'd say a 50% chance. Yeah, her sons have a 50% chance. Half of them will get the big H from her, half of them will get a little H. Yep. Cool. All right, what do we know about this daughter right here? Do we know anything about her? Yeah, we know she has X capital H. Look, she's not shaded, so we know she has X capital H. What about the other one? Yep. Yeah, says we know she's also X little h. How do we know that? Because she had to have gotten that from her father. Yeah. She had to have gotten that from her father. It's the only thing her father's passing on. So again, if you wanted to, you could shade this individual. She too is a carrier because of her dad. How about the mom up here? The mom that married in, the second generation mom. We know she's X big H. She's not shaded. What about that second allele? Do we know for a fact that second allele is? We do not. We do not. So leave it blank. Someone earlier said, can you draw the, we know she's an X, right? Can you draw it with an X and a blank up top? Yeah, I'm okay with that too. I usually just leave blank, but yeah, you could write X with a blank up here too. That's fine. Yep, absolutely. Questions on sex-linked recessive? All right, just one more to do, and that is, you've probably guessed it. Sex-linked dominant. This one's tough. This one's really tough. I'll be honest with you. I usually ask questions like, could it be sex-linked dominant? Could it be? There's usually not a defining thing that stands out that says it's definitely. So I usually ask, could it be, when I ask questions on tests and whatnot. But hey, not really something we need to worry about this year, right? But the most surefire way to tell you have a dominant trait, an X-linked dominant trait, that all daughters of an affected male will have the trait. Period. End of story. So if color blindness were a dominant trait, man, there'd be a lot more colorblind women. A lot more. Because again, if it's a dominant trait, that father is passing that X on to his daughters. If he passed the Y on, they'd be sons. They wouldn't be daughters. So they all got the dominant allele, which makes them colorblind. Or whatever. Well, colorblind is not a dominant trait, so it's a bad example. Do we know what their other allele is going to be? How do you know that? Excellent. Yep. Guys, if mom doesn't have it, remember it's a dominant allele, so if mom doesn't have it, she must be X little a, X little a. She has to be. If she had even one big A, she'd be shaded in. That means we know for a fact that these daughters are all heterozygous because they have to get the little a from mom. They have to. Oh, if it's still an X-linked dominant, but now the mom has it and that doesn't, yeah, all the sons would have to have it, correct? Because they would have had to have gotten it from mom. And going backwards on that, if this mom has a son, I guarantee that they don't have the trait. The only thing that her son could get would be X away. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. If a mom has the trait and it's X-linked dominant, every child they have will have the trait, correct? Regardless of what the dad is, if it's X-linked dominant, because the daughters will have gotten at least one X from their mom. If she's homozygous dominant, they'll have it, correct? Yep. Now again, guys, I'll be honest, this one's tough because could this be autosomal recessive? Yeah. Yeah. What this could definitely be autosomal recessive. What if mom's heterozygous? We just don't know it. Isn't it possible that all the daughters just happen to get the little a from mom? So yeah, definitely. Is it possible this is autosomal dominant? Doesn't even matter what he is. If it's autosomal dominant, what if all the daughters got a big B from dad? Who cares what they got from mom? So yeah, this one could be autosomal dominant. It could be autosomal recessive. It could be sex-linked recessive. Possible. It's possible. So it's really hard to say for a fact that this is sex-linked dominant. Really hard for a fact. That's why I usually ask, could it be? But again, if it's sex-linked dominant, dads have to pass it on to their daughters. So if you ever saw one like this, guess what? Not X-linked dominant. Again, a lot of times it's easier to rule out what something is than to rule it in. We aren't sure for a fact this is X-linked dominant, but we know for a fact this one's not X-linked dominant. Make sense? Fun times, huh? Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.